I'm curious your thoughts on the ultimatum and whether next Thursday is real.
I find it very hard to believe that a proposal this far-reaching could be hammered out in a way that would be agreeable, not just to the Russians and the Ukrainians, but to the Europeans in some fashion as well. I personally, in diplomacy, am a big believer in putting hardcore ideas on the table as a starting point, but expecting that it could be resolved and that these issues could be negotiated by Thursday seems inconceivable to me.
Well, Meghan, let's talk about the pressure on the other side, because we have the two Russian oil giants that are supposed to be sanctioned as of today. Now, President Trump said this morning that it would happen very soon. We're not clear on what that means. The first question is, are those sanctions going to go into effect, do you think? And secondly, perhaps more importantly, do those sanctions work? We've seen this time and again, administrations that you worked for and all up into the current one. Is this going to work?
So several questions there. One, are those sanctions going to go into place? I would say we don't know at this point. The whole proposal is a little bit of a surprise, because it really did seem that President Trump was moving in the direction where he understood that Putin was playing him to some extent. And so there was that momentum to put more economic pressure on Russia. My guess is that there'll be some kind of suspension while this is being worked out, and as long as there are genuine negotiations going on around these ideas in the 28-point plan. Now, do these sanctions work if they are put into place? That's a big question, in the sense of, do they work? Will they lead Russia to be more accommodating? Is hard to know, but they will have an effect on Russia's economy. So these sanctions, we've had sanctions in place on Russia now for 3.5 years, as has the European and many other countries. They have had an effect, but they haven't been implemented very strongly. And so this is a move in the direction for more economic pressure. There's frankly a lot more that could be done with sanctions, and they could be implemented even more aggressively, that would create more economic pressure on Putin, and the extent to which that will change his calculations on something that he sees as existential to his rule and to his legacy is another question.
We learned the president spoke with German Chancellor Merz a short time ago. Meghan, I'm curious what Merz thinks of this, what Macron thinks of this, what Starmer makes of this deal.
I think what we're seeing is the European leaders in private are probably very alarmed, but in public, I think they're taking the appropriate approach to say, let's see if we can come to an agreement that creates a just and lasting peace. And that's what the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said on his way to the G20 meetings, that, we're all interested in the same objective. Now, this agreement or this proposal, as we've seen it and the provisions discussed, has major implications for Europe. This is not just about Ukraine. This essentially would say that NATO can no longer expand. Keep in mind that Sweden and Finland just joined NATO last year. This is something that the Europeans will want to have a say in. It also limits and downsizes what is currently Europe's largest and most battle-tested and probably most technologically innovative military on the entire continent. So that is something that the Europeans will have a major interest in. It also, as I understand it, commits the Europeans to funding a significant part of the Ukrainian reconstruction. That should be part of the incentive for Ukrainians to agree to this. So the Europeans may have been treated as if they're superfluous to this agreement, but they're not. They're actually, their interests are very core. The idea that one could promise to Putin and to Russia that Russia will be integrated into the global economy if Europe is offside, I think is not a realistic one. You just have to think of how Iran was promised that it would be integrated into the global economy after the nuclear deal under President Obama, and that didn't happen for a whole lot of reasons, even though the U.S. administration really wanted to see it.
Meghan, I just want to step in with some breaking news here that just crossed the terminal. A red headline on Nvidia, of all companies, of course, a big newsmaker this week, for the better with regard to its earnings report. It was dogged in the sell-off yesterday. It's back up today and rising on a headline. Nvidia shares climbing to session high as U.S. officials have early discussions about whether to allow the company to sell its H200 artificial intelligence chips to China. The H20s here. Pretty interesting moment to see Nvidia shares now really taking off on this news, up almost 2%, more than $3. Broadcom is just barely positive right now, and AMD is up about 0.5%. A redhead on Nvidia. It's something that we're going to be talking about here with regard to export controls and national security, whether we're talking about China or Saudi Arabia. Michelle, the stories seem to start bumping into each other here.
Well, for sure, and it all goes back to this argument of tech transfers, and can you always be sure that these pledges can remain in place and provide the national security protections that we need.
Meghan O'Sullivan, of course, coming from her role as former Deputy National Security Advisor, probably has some thoughts about this, Meghan. I don't mean to sneak up with you on that, but there are concerns here in Washington that we're mortgaging our national security when it comes to providing AI chips like these, F-35s to Saudi Arabia. Where do you fall on it?
Yeah, I think this is a very large concern on the part of Washington. I think some of it goes, I'm aware, like some of this goes to how far ahead you think China is. Is it actually very close to reaching or matching the U.S. capability when it comes to these chips and it comes to the development of AI? And if you think it is right on America's heels, then maybe you think allowing them to import very high-end chips is not going to change the landscape very much. But I am much more sympathetic to the argument that America still has a substantial lead, and keeping high-end chips from China for as long as we can is probably in our national security interests. Now, that doesn't mean that we can keep China from developing AI and that it won't make progress over time, but export controls have been a very important part of our ability to maintain a technological edge, which I believe the U.S. still maintains.
Well, Meghan, there's also this kind of prosperity argument on the part of particularly those from Silicon Valley that say, including Jensen Huang, that say that you can provide this technology with the protections and actually the benefits outweigh any of those risks, which they see as diminished. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think how I would respond to that is I would like to see some more data on that. I think Jensen Huang, clearly has an interest in expanding sales into China for reasons that are clear. And whether or not this is a prosperity argument in the sense, a global prosperity argument, I think really overlooks the key dynamic in the global international system, which is the competitive dynamic between the United States and China. And that dynamic is not going to be glossed over. It's not going to be diminished simply because we lift export controls on our most sensitive technologies. That dynamic is going to be maintained and be one of the fiercest competitions in the global arena for the coming years. And technology is the key component of that competition between the U.S. and China. And I think, selling high-end chips is not going to make that dynamic disappear. It just might yield one of America's competitive edges.
Well, Meghan, as I understand, I don't want to turn away from this conversation, which is an important one. But when we look at South Africa today, this week, we're headed into a weekend where the U.S. will not be present at the G20. You've done a lot of work at the Belfer Center at what you call the middle powers. I want to know, what is your reaction to that? How do you frame this snub in the context of what it means for the world, middle powers, and for the U.S.?
So thanks for mentioning the work that we do here at Belfer on middle powers. It's a new project that really acknowledges there are a large number of powerful countries. For those of you my age and older, certainly we used to think about non-aligned powers, and they weren't really consequential. But middle powers today are those countries that have prospered over the last 30 years. The Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa's, Indonesia's, others that actually have a real influence on the global economy, have an influence on global issues like climate and trade and technology. And they are core to the G20. And so for the U.S. to snub the G20, I think is not very forward-looking, because right now, the U.S. and China are involved not only in that competitive dynamic with one another, they're involved in competing for the alliance, the friendship, and the sympathy of these middle powers who matter more and more.